There are wounds that cut deeper than any sword, and for Ingrid they came from the cruel words of her own people. Every day in the village of Nordheim she endured the whispers and pointing fingers that branded her the ugliest woman anyone had ever seen. Her father, desperate and ashamed, finally found someone willing to take her, a towering Viking warrior named Bjorn, who offered nothing but a pair of old boots in trade. The villagers laughed and shook their heads, certain this giant would treat her like a slave. But Bjorn was not like other men. He had spent years fighting battles and watching friends die, and he understood something the village fools never would. True beauty comes from kindness, loyalty, and a heart that refuses to break. What happens when a discarded woman meets a man who sees her real worth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories that refused to fade, and Ingrid pulled her rough woolen cloak tighter as she made her way down the muddy path toward the village well. 23 winters had carved their mark upon her face. Not the gentle lines that came with laughter and contentment, but the jagged reminders of a childhood accident that had left her cheek twisted and her left eye drooping slightly. The scar tissue had healed white against her pale skin, creating a pattern that might have been considered distinctive, even striking, in a kinder world. But Nordheim was not a kind world. The settlement sprawled along the rocky coastline like a collection of weathered bones, its wooden longhouses and storage sheds built to withstand the harsh Norwegian winters and the harsher judgments of its inhabitants. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the scent of fish stew and barley bread, while the sound of axes splitting wood echoed between the buildings. Children ran between the houses, their voices bright with the careless joy of youth. But they fell silent when Ingrid passed, their mothers pulling them closer with protective gestures that spoke louder than words. At the heart of the settlement stood the village well, its stone rim worn smooth by countless hands, drawing water, and countless tongues sharpening themselves on gossip. The ancient stone bore runic carvings from generations past, though few could read them now. It was here that the women gathered each morning, ostensibly to collect water for their households, but truly to exchange the currency that kept their small world turning, information, speculation, and judgment. Ingrid approached with the resigned grace of someone who had learned to move through hostile territory. Her wooden bucket bore the scratches and dents of years of use, much like her spirit. The other women were already assembled. Astrid, her stepmother, whose beauty had begun to fade but whose cruelty remained sharp as ever. Helga, the baker's wife, whose tongue was as quick as her husband's bread was stale. And young Sigrid, barely 16 and already cruel in the way that only the young and beautiful could be. "Look what crawls from the shadows," Astrid announced as Ingrid approached. Her voice carried the particular venom reserved for family members who had disappointed. The sun's barely risen, and already the day grows uglier. Helga tittered behind her hand. Perhaps she frightens the sun back down behind the mountains. Even the gods must weep to look upon such a sight. Ingrid said nothing, focusing instead on lowering her bucket into the well's depths. The rope was rough against her palms that bore calluses from years of work that others took for granted. She had learned long ago that responding to their taunts only provided more ammunition for their assault. "My father says no man will ever want her," Sigrid added, her young voice bright with casual cruelty. "He says she'll die alone, tending other people's children because she's too hideous to bear her own." The words struck deep, as they were meant to. Ingrid had indeed spent countless hours watching the children of others, telling them stories, and teaching them to identify healing herbs, while their parents enjoyed the freedom her presence provided. She loved those children, their innocent laughter, their wonder at simple things, their ability to see past her scars to the person beneath. But Sigrid's observation was accurate in its unkindness. Ingrid would likely never have children of her own. Perhaps Helga mused with false thoughtfulness. We could trade her to the trolls. They might find her acceptable, being creatures of similar enough. The single word cut through their laughter like an axe through kindling. The women turned to see Gunnar approaching, Ingrid's father, his weathered face set in lines of barely controlled anger. He was not a large man, nor particularly imposing, but desperation had given his voice an edge that made even Astrid step back slightly. "You have said enough," he repeated, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the group. "Find other entertainment. For your empty mornings." Astrid's face flushed with indignation. "She is my stepdaughter. I will speak of her as I see fit." "She is my blood," Gunnar replied quietly, "and I will not have her mocked like a trained bear at a feast." The tension stretched between them like a bowstring drawn too tight. Ingrid watched her father with a mixture of gratitude and pity. She knew his defense of her came not from love that had died with her mother years ago, but from pride. In a world where a man's worth was measured by his family's standing, having a daughter who drew mockery reflected poorly on him. "Come, Ingrid," he said without looking at her. "We have matters to discuss." She hauled her bucket from the well, water sloshing against the wooden sides, and followed him back toward their modest dwelling. Behind them, the women's voices rose again, but now their speculation turned to what matters might require such urgency. In a settlement where privacy was a luxury few could afford, any deviation from routine became immediate entertainment. Their home was smaller than most, consisting of a single main room with a sleeping alcove and a storage area where Ingrid kept her few possessions. The hearth dominated one wall, its stones blackened by years of fires that provided warmth and light during the long winter months. Above the mantel hung her mother's loom, its wooden frame warped and cracked, several of the threads hanging loose like broken promises. Gunnar rarely spoke of his late wife, but Ingrid knew she had been beautiful, possessed of the golden hair and smooth skin that Viking men prized above all else. The loom served as both monument and reproach, a reminder of what their family had lost and what Ingrid had failed to inherit. "Sit," Gunnar said, gesturing toward the rough wooden stool beside the hearth. Ingrid complied, setting her bucket carefully. On the packed earth floor, her father began pacing, a habit that emerged whenever he faced decisions too heavy for his usually practical nature. "You are 23 winters old," he began, stating a fact they both knew well. "Yes, father. In most households, daughters your age would have been married for years. They would have brought honor to their families through advantageous matches, strengthened alliances, provided grandchildren. I know what daughters are supposed to do," Ingrid interrupted gently. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. "I have tried, Ingrid. For 7 years, I have approached every eligible man within 3 days' journey. I have offered what dowry I could scrape together, made promises I could barely keep, even suggested arrangements that would have cost me greatly." She nodded. She had been aware of his efforts, though they had never discussed them openly. She had seen him return from trips to neighboring settlements with his shoulders set in defeat, had watched him count and recount their meager savings, had heard him speaking in urgent whispers with other fathers who might have sons in need of wives. "No one will have me," she said simply. "I understand this." "No, you don't understand." His voice cracked slightly. "You cannot understand what it means for a father to watch his daughter wither like grain left too long in the field. You cannot know the shame of hearing other men speak of their daughters' marriages while mine remains a burden." Ingrid finished for him. The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Gunnar's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment he looked every one of his 58 years. "I have found someone," he said finally. Ingrid felt her heart skip, though whether from hope or fear she could not say. "Someone? A warrior. He lives. And north of here, in the high valley where the pine trees grow thick, his name is Bjorn Ironhand, and he has agreed to—" Gunnar paused, struggling with the words. "He has agreed to take you." "Take me!" Ingrid's voice was barely a whisper. "What does he want in return?" Her father's gaze fell to the floor. Boots, a pair of good leather boots. The silence that followed was deafening. Ingrid stared at her father, trying to process what he had just told her. She had known her prospects were poor, had accepted that any marriage would likely be more transaction than romance, but to be traded for footwear— "I see," she said finally, proud that her voice remained steady. "He is not cruel," Gunnar added quickly, as if this could somehow soften the blow. "The men who told me of him say he keeps to himself, causes no trouble. He fought in the raids against the Saxon coast and earned his nickname from the strength of his sword arm. And he wants a wife badly enough to trade boots for the ugliest woman in Nordheim? Do not speak of yourself so," Gunnar snapped, then immediately looked ashamed of his outburst. "You have qualities beyond appearance. You know the healing herbs better than anyone, since your mother died. You can read the old runes, tell the ancient stories. You work hard and complain little. These were practical virtues, the kind that might matter to a farmer choosing a plough horse. But Ingrid understood they were also the only currency she possessed in the marriage market. "When?" she asked. "3 days hence. He will come to collect you at midday." Ingrid nodded slowly. 3 days to prepare for a life she could not imagine with a man she had never met, in a place she had never seen. It was, she realized, more time than most slaves received when they were sold. "I should pack my things," she said, rising from the stool. "Ingrid," her father's voice caught her at the entrance to the sleeping alcove. When she turned, she saw tears glittering in his eyes. "I am sorry for all of it. Your mother would have found a better way." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had given her life and then struggled to know what to do with it. His intentions had been good, she believed, even when his actions caused pain. "Perhaps this Bjorn will be kinder than we expect," she said, offering what comfort she could. But even as she spoke the words, she did not believe them. In her experience, men who acquired wives through unusual transactions rarely treated them as treasured possessions. More likely, she would find herself serving as cook, cleaner, and whatever else this Bjorn Ironhand might require of a woman obtained for the price of footwear. As she gathered her few belongings, 2 rough dresses, her mother's bone comb, a collection of dried herbs, and the small silver amulet that had belonged to her grandmother, Ingrid tried to imagine what awaited her. Would his home be warm? Would he speak kindly or rule through fear? Would he allow her to continue her healing work, or would he consider such knowledge dangerous in a woman? Outside, she could hear the sounds of the settlement continuing its daily rhythm. Children played, men worked, women gossiped by the well. Soon she would be gone from this place that had never welcomed her, heading toward an unknown future with a stranger who valued her no more highly than a pair of well-made boots. Yet as she folded her dresses carefully into her worn leather satchel, Ingrid felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not hope exactly. She had learned better than to hope, but something like possibility. For the first time in her adult life, she would be leaving Nordheim and its daily cruelties behind. Whatever awaited her in the high valley might be harsh, but it could hardly be worse than the familiar torments she was leaving behind. And if this Bjorn Ironhand proved to be as heartless as she feared, at least she would face that cruelty in a new place, where the stones themselves had not been witness to years of her humiliation. The third dawn came grey and cold, with frost clinging to the wooden shutters like tears that had frozen in the night. Ingrid had barely slept, her mind turning over possibilities like stones in a restless stream. She had tried to prepare herself for any manner of man, brutal or indifferent, crude or merely practical. But her imagination failed her when she attempted to picture the face that would look upon her with the casual interest of someone inspecting newly acquired property. By mid-morning, word had spread through Nordheim that the transaction would take place at the village centre, near the great oak that had stood since the settlement's founding. The tree's massive trunk bore countless scars from axes and knives, marking everything from territory disputes to lovers' promises, and now it would witness Ingrid's passage from unwanted daughter to purchased wife. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a deep blue wool that her mother had dyed with precious indigo years ago. The color brought out the clear gray of her eyes, though she doubted anyone would notice such details. Around her neck, she wore her grandmother's silver amulet, a delicate piece worked with runes she had never learned to read. It was her only inheritance of value, and wearing it felt like carrying a piece of her mother's strength. Gunnar waited by the door, his face set in grim lines. He carried a small leather pouch that contained what remained of their savings, a few silver coins that would see him through the winter months. The sight of it reminded Ingrid that her departure would ease more than just the social burden of her presence. "Are you ready?" he asked, though they both knew readiness was not truly possible for such a moment. She nodded and followed him outside. Already, a crowd had begun to gather near the oak tree. Not the entire village, but enough curious onlookers to ensure that her final humiliation would be properly witnessed and remembered. She recognized most of the faces, neighbors who had watched her grow from a scarred child into a scarred woman, whose expressions ranged from pity to cruel amusement. Astrid stood with her friends, whispering behind her hand with the barely contained excitement of someone witnessing a particularly entertaining tragedy. Young Sigrid practically bounced on her toes, as if the day's events were a festival arranged solely for her amusement. "There she is," someone murmured as Ingrid approached. "Poor creature doesn't know what awaits her. Better than dying a spinster," another voice replied. "At least she'll serve some purpose." The comments followed her like flies attracted to something rotting, but Ingrid kept her eyes fixed on the great oak's ancient trunk. She had spent countless hours beneath its spreading branches as a child, listening to her mother tell stories of brave warriors and wise women. Now it would serve as the marker of her own story's strangest chapter. A commotion at the settlement's northern edge drew everyone's attention. A figure approached on foot, leading a sturdy mountain pony loaded with travel packs. Even at a distance, his size was unmistakable. He stood nearly a full head taller than the tallest man in Nordheim, with shoulders that spoke of years swinging sword and axe. His hair was dark brown, streaked with premature silver, and fell to his shoulders beneath a simple leather cap. As he drew closer, details became clearer. His face was weathered by wind and sun, marked with several small scars that spoke of battles. Survived. His clothing was practical rather than fine, well made but without ornamentation, the garb of a man who valued function over display. Most notably, his feet were wrapped in rough cloth bindings, explaining his need for proper boots. "That's him," Gunnar whispered unnecessarily. The man, Bjorn Ironhand, approached with the measured stride of someone accustomed to long journeys. His pale blue eyes swept over the gathered crowd with mild interest, as if he encountered such assemblies regularly. When his gaze fell upon Ingrid, it lingered for a moment, but his expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "You are Gunnar Eriksson?" His voice was deep and calm, with the accent of the northern valleys. "I am." "And you are Bjorn Ironhand?" "I am." He reached into his travel pack and withdrew a pair of boots that made several onlookers gasp with appreciation. The leather was thick and supple, dyed a rich brown, with iron studs at heel and toe. The craftsmanship was exceptional. These were boots that could last a man through years of hard travel and harsh weather. "As agreed," Bjorn said, offering them to Gunnar. Gunnar took the boots with hands that shook slightly, weighing them as if surprised by their quality. "They are fine work. They should serve you well." Bjorn's attention returned to Ingrid. "You are ready to travel?" The question was directed to her rather than her father, which surprised everyone present. In most such transactions, the woman was discussed rather than addressed. "I am," Ingrid replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. "The journey will take most of the day. The path grows steep once we leave the valley." Again, he spoke to her directly, as if her comfort and understanding mattered. The crowd murmured at this breach of normal protocol. "I understand." Bjorn nodded and moved to his pony, checking the pack straps with practiced efficiency. "We should depart while the light is good. "Wait!" Astrid called out, her voice sharp with malicious glee. "Should we not have some ceremony? Some blessing for the happy couple?" Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd. The suggestion was meant to embarrass, to highlight the absurdity of calling this transaction a marriage, to mock both Ingrid's desperation and Bjorn's strange choice. Bjorn straightened slowly and turned to face Astrid. His expression remained neutral, but something in his stillness made the laughter fade. "What ceremony would you suggest?" he asked mildly. Astrid's smile faltered slightly. She had expected him to ignore her jibe, or perhaps respond with crude humor. His calm attention unbalanced her. "Why, a kiss, of course," she recovered, "to seal the bargain properly." More laughter erupted, crueler now. Ingrid felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding the trap. Astrid sought to force a moment of intimacy that would humiliate both bride and groom, to highlight Ingrid's unworthiness and Bjorn's desperation. "A reasonable custom," Bjorn said. He approached Ingrid with the same measured pace he had used when entering the settlement. The crowd fell silent, sensing they were about to witness something memorable. Ingrid looked up into his face, expecting to see embarrassment or resignation, but found instead a calm certainty that confused her. "If you permit," he said quietly, so only she could hear. The request for permission stunned her. No man had ever asked her consent for anything, much less in front of witnesses who would remember such unprecedented courtesy. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Bjorn's hands were gentle as they cupped her face, his thumbs brushing along her scarred cheek with careful tenderness. His kiss was soft and brief, but unmistakably genuine, not the perfunctory gesture the crowd had expected, but something that carried respect and perhaps even affection. When he stepped back, the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Astrid's expression had shifted from malicious glee to bewildered frustration, while other faces showed similar confusion. They had gathered to witness humiliation, but what they had seen defied their expectations. "Now we may go," Bjorn said. Returning to his pony, Ingrid gathered her leather satchel and followed him, her mind reeling from what had just occurred. The kiss itself had been surprising enough, but the way he had touched her face, as if her scars were simply part of her, neither shameful nor pitiable, left her questioning everything she thought she knew about her situation. "Farewell, father," she replied. Then she was following Bjorn up the steep path that led away from Nordheim, her old life shrinking behind her with each step. The mountain pony plodded steadily beside them, its hoofbeats keeping rhythm with their footfalls. Bjorn set a pace that was brisk but not punishing, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was managing the climb. They walked in silence for the first hour, leaving the familiar sights and sounds of the settlement far below. The path wound through stands of pine and birch, their autumn colors brilliant against the grey sky. Ingrid found herself stealing glances at her new husband, for that was what he was now, regardless of how strangely their union had come about. His profile was strong but not harsh, marked by lines that suggested thoughtfulness rather than cruelty. His hands, when she glimpsed them, bore calluses that spoke of hard work rather than idleness. Most surprisingly, he seemed content with their silence, neither demanding conversation nor ignoring her presence entirely. As the sun reached its peak and began its descent toward the western mountains, Ingrid realized that nothing about this day had unfolded as she had expected. The man walking beside her bore no resemblance to the crude warrior or desperate widower she had imagined. His treatment of her had been more respectful than anything she had experienced from the men of her own village. Whatever lay ahead in the high valley, whatever challenges this strange marriage might bring, she was beginning to suspect that Bjorn Ironhand was not the kind of man who would treat a wife acquired for boots as mere property. The possibility both thrilled and terrified her, opening doorways in her mind that she had thought permanently sealed. The sun was casting long shadows through the pine boughs when they finally crested the last ridge, and Ingrid caught her first glimpse of Bjorn's homestead. The sight took her breath away, not from grandeur, for it was modest in size, but from its unexpected beauty and evident care. The main hall sat in a natural clearing beside a swift-running stream, its timber walls weathered silver by mountain storms, but solid as stone. Smoke rose from the central hearth, speaking of warmth and comfort within. To one side stood a well-built stable, and beyond that, several smaller outbuildings arranged with thoughtful precision. Gardens, now dormant for winter, showed the neat rows of someone who understood both cultivation and patience. But what struck Ingrid most profoundly was the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the place. No harsh voices carried on the wind, no sounds of argument or discord. Even the animals, a few hardy mountain sheep, several chickens pecking in the yard, and a massive grey dog that emerged to greet them, moved with the relaxed confidence of creatures that knew no cruelty. "Welcome to Raven's Holm," Bjorn said quietly, the first words he had spoken in over an hour. The name suited the place. Ravens were wise birds, Ingrid knew, loyal to their mates and fierce in protecting their territory. As if summoned by her thoughts, a large black bird called from the pine trees overhead, its voice echoing across the valley. The grey dog approached with dignified steps, its intelligent eyes studying Ingrid with careful assessment. She had always been good with animals. They seemed to sense her gentleness and responded to it more readily than people ever had. "His name is Grimmer," Bjorn said. "He will need to approve of you before you can truly belong here." There was something in his tone that made Ingrid look at him sharply. He spoke as if her belonging mattered to him, as if this place might become home rather than simply shelter. She knelt slowly, extending her hand palm up toward the dog. Grimmer approached cautiously, his nose working to catalogue her scent. When he finally allowed her to touch his grizzled head, his tail gave a single measured wag. "He likes you," Bjorn observed, with what might have been relief. "That is good. Grimmer is an excellent judge of character." Before Ingrid could respond, the hall's heavy wooden door swung open and two figures emerged. A woman of perhaps 40 winters approached with quick, efficient steps, her brown hair bound in practical braids and her clothing speaking of comfortable prosperity. Behind her came a younger man, barely out of boyhood, whose eager expression suggested he found their arrival genuinely exciting. "So," the woman said, stopping before them with hands planted firmly on her hips, "this is the bride we have heard nothing about." Her tone was not unkind, but it carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing household affairs. Ingrid felt herself tense, preparing for the familiar assessment that would find her lacking. "Ragnar," Bjorn said with evident fondness, "I would have you meet Ingrid, my wife. Ingrid, this is Ragnar, who keeps my household running and my meals edible, and her son Olaf, who knows more about caring for animals than men twice his age." "Wife?" Ragnar's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "When did you acquire a wife, and why were we not told to prepare properly?" "The arrangement was made quickly," Bjorn replied, with what Ingrid was beginning to recognize as his characteristic calm. "And I saw no need for elaborate preparations." Ragnar turned her sharp gaze on Ingrid, who braced herself for the inevitable reaction to her scars. But the assessment she received was different from what she was used to. Practical rather than cruel, measuring her as a person rather than dismissing her as a disappointment. "Well," Ragnar said finally, "you look like you have sense, which is more than can be said for most women who would marry this stubborn ox. Can you cook?" "Yes," Ingrid replied, finding her voice. "Tend wounds. I know something of healing. Keep house? I have managed my father's home since my mother died." Ragnar nodded approvingly. "Good. Can you read?" The question surprised Ingrid. Literacy was not common, especially among women, and she had not expected it to matter in a mountain homestead. "Some. My mother taught me the runes better and better." Ragnar's stern expression softened slightly. "You'll find we do things differently here than in most households. Master Bjorn believes in using whatever talents each person possesses, regardless of their station. If you have skills beyond cooking and cleaning, they will be valued. This was so far from what Ingrid had expected that she could only stare. In her experience, women's talents were useful only insofar as they served men's immediate needs. The idea that her abilities might be valued for their own sake was almost incomprehensible. "Come," Ragnar continued, gesturing toward the hall. "You must be weary from your journey, and the evening meal is nearly ready. Olaf, see to the pony." The boy nodded eagerly and moved to help Bjorn with the travel packs. As they walked toward the hall, Ragnar fell into step beside Ingrid. "I should warn you," she said in a lower voice. "Master Bjorn is not like other men. He has strange ideas about fairness and kindness. Some might call them weaknesses, but those who do so are fools. His honor is absolute, and his word is iron. If he has taken you as wife, he will treat you as such, regardless of whatever arrangement brought you here." The hall's interior took Ingrid's breath away once again. The central hearth was magnificent, built of carefully fitted stones, and large enough to warm the entire space, even on the coldest nights. Its flames danced across walls, decorated not with weapons or hunting trophies, but with beautifully carved wooden panels depicting scenes from the old stories. The workmanship was exquisite, each figure rendered with skill and obvious love for the craft. Long tables filled the center of the room, but they were not the rough-hewn boards she was used to. These had been planned smooth and rubbed with oil until they gleamed like honey in the firelight. Benches with carved backs provided seating that looked actually comfortable, while oil lamps hanging from the rafters cast warm light into every corner. "This is beautiful," Ingrid whispered, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "Master Bjorn carved most of it himself during the long winter evenings," Ragnar said with evident pride. "He says a home should feed the spirit as well as the body." Bjorn appeared at Ingrid's shoulder, carrying her small satchel. "Ragnar will show you where you may rest and refresh yourself. The evening meal will be ready soon." "Where?" Ingrid began, then stopped, uncertain how to ask about sleeping arrangements without seeming forward or presumptuous. "You will have the chamber behind the hearth," he said, understanding her unspoken question. "It is warm and private, with space for your belongings. I sleep in the loft above the main hall." Relief flooded through her. She had feared being thrust immediately into intimacies she was not prepared for, with a man she barely knew. His consideration in providing separate quarters spoke to a thoughtfulness she had not dared hope for. Ragnar led her to a room that was small but comfortable, with a real bed rather than a simple sleeping shelf, and a wooden chest for storing clothes. A small window looked out over the garden and stream, offering views that would be lovely in daylight. "There is water for washing," Ragnar said, indicating a pitcher and basin on a small table. "Take what time you need. We eat when you are ready." Alone for the first time since leaving Nordheim, Ingrid sank onto the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of her new reality. The kindness she had encountered, from Bjorn, from Ragnar, even from young Olaf, felt almost dreamlike after years of casual cruelty. The beauty of the homestead, the evident care with which everything had been arranged, the promise of being valued for her abilities rather than tolerated for her usefulness, all of it seemed too good to be true. Yet here she was, in a warm room that was hers alone, preparing to share a meal with people who had already shown her more courtesy than she had received in months. Whatever this strange marriage might become, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was beginning to understand that her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined when she watched her father count those silver coins just 4 days ago. The morning sun streamed through Ingrid's small window, painting golden squares on the wooden floor and waking her more gently than she had been roused in years. For a moment she lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home, the murmur of the stream, birds calling from the pine trees, and the soft sound of someone moving about in the main hall. She had slept better than she could remember, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of lavender and cedar rather than the musty dampness she was accustomed to. The bed itself was a revelation, soft enough to cradle her tired bones, yet firm enough to provide real support. Even such simple comfort felt like luxury after years of sleeping on a thin straw mattress. Rising carefully, she dressed in her second-best gown and arranged her hair as neatly as possible. As the face that looked back at her from the polished metal mirror beside the wash basin was the same as always, scarred and asymmetrical, but somehow it seemed less shameful in this gentle light. When she emerged from her chamber, she found Bjorn, seated at one of the long tables, working on something with complete concentration. Before him lay a piece of pale wood, partially carved into what would clearly become a bowl. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he shaped the curve of the rim, each cut precise and purposeful. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "Oh, good morning. I hope you rested well." "Better than I have in a very long time." The honesty of her response seemed to please him. "I am glad. Ragnar has prepared morning food, but I wanted to finish this while the light was good." He held up the partially completed bowl. "The wood told me it wished to hold soup, and I have learned not to argue with such requests." There was humor in his voice, but Ingrid sensed he was not entirely jesting. She had heard woodworkers speak of their craft in similar terms, as if the material itself had preferences that must be respected. "It's beautiful work," she said, moving closer to examine it. The bowl's walls were perfectly even, its surface smooth as river stones. "Where did you learn such skill?" "My father was a ship's carpenter before he settled here. He taught me to see what the wood wanted to become, then help it find that shape." Bjorn's expression grew thoughtful. He said the best craftsmen never force their will upon their materials. They listen, they understand, they work with rather than against. Ingrid found herself wondering if his approach to people followed similar principles. Certainly his treatment of her thus far suggested someone who preferred cooperation to domination. "Would you like to see how it's done?" he asked, offering her the carving knife. The suggestion startled her. In her experience, men guarded their skills jealously, especially from women who might have no practical use for such knowledge. Yet Bjorn seemed genuinely eager to share his craft. "I might ruin it," she protested. "Then we will start with a different piece of wood." He rose and moved to a wooden chest near the wall, returning with a smaller block of birch. "This one wishes to become a cup, I think. Would you help it find its proper shape?" His hands were warm and steady as he guided hers, showing her how to hold the knife at the proper angle, how to read the grain to avoid splits and tears. The work required patience and attention, qualities Ingrid possessed in abundance from her herb gathering and healing preparations. "Feel how the wood responds," Bjorn murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he stood close enough to guide. "Her movements. It will tell you when you are cutting with its nature or against it." She found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the work, small curls of pale wood falling away to reveal the cup's emerging form. Under Bjorn's patient instruction, what had seemed impossible began to make sense. Her movements grew more confident, more intuitive. "You have good hands for this," he observed. "Steady and careful. Many warriors I have known lacked such delicacy." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Praise for her abilities was rare enough to be treasured, especially from someone whose own skills were clearly considerable. They worked together in comfortable silence until Ragnar appeared with bowls of porridge sweetened with honey and studded with dried berries. The morning meal was simple but satisfying, and Ingrid found herself genuinely hungry for the first time in weeks. "Olaf has asked if you would like to see the animals," Ragnar mentioned as they ate. "He takes great pride in their care and loves showing off his charges." "I would enjoy that very much," Ingrid replied. She had always found peace in the company of animals, who judged her not at all and responded to kindness with simple, uncomplicated affection. After breaking their fast, Olaf appeared with barely contained excitement and led her on a tour of the homestead's inhabitants. The chickens were plump and healthy, their coop clean and well-maintained. The sheep were sturdy mountain stock, their wool thick and clean, but it was the milk cow that truly impressed her. A gentle brown creature with intelligent eyes and an udder that spoke of good breeding and excellent care. Master Bjorn says animals are partners, not just property, Olaf explained, as he scratched behind the cow's ears. He says if we care for them properly, they will care for us in return. A wise philosophy, Ingrid agreed. She had seen too many farms where animals were treated as mere tools, worked until they broke and then discarded without thought. "Can you milk?" Olaf asked hopefully. "My hands are still small, and sometimes she grows impatient with me." "I can try." Ingrid had learned the skill as a child, though she had not practiced it recently. The cow accepted her touch without complaint, and soon warm milk was streaming into the bucket with a steady rhythm. Olaf watched with admiration that made Ingrid smile. "You are good at everything," he declared with the absolute conviction of youth. "Hardly," she laughed. "But I am willing to learn, and that counts for something." When they returned to the hall, Bjorn was putting the finishing touches on his bowl, rubbing it with oil until it gleamed. He looked up as they entered, his eyes going immediately to Ingrid's face. "You look happy," he observed, and something in his voice suggested this pleased him greatly. "I am," she realized with surprise. "I cannot remember the last time I felt—" She searched for the right word. "Useful, welcomed." "You are both here," he said simply. "This is your home now, Ingrid. Not because I own you, but because you belong here. There is a difference." The distinction was profound, and one she was only beginning to understand. Ownership implied possession, control, the right to use or discard as one saw fit. Belonging suggested something far more precious, acceptance, value, a place in the world that was hers by right rather than by sufferance. As the day progressed and she found herself falling into the rhythm of household tasks, Ingrid began to understand what Ragnar had meant about Bjorn's strange ideas. He asked for her opinions on matters large and small, from the arrangement of the storage areas to the best herbs for preserving meat. When she suggested improvements to the garden layout based on her mother's teachings, he listened carefully and agreed to implement her ideas come spring. Most remarkably, he seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. During the evening meal, he asked about her childhood, her mother's stories, her knowledge of healing plants. His questions were thoughtful, and his attention complete, as if her answers truly mattered to him. When she finally retired to her chamber that second night, Ingrid lay awake for a long time, staring at the wooden ceiling and trying to adjust to this new reality. The hand-carved wooden bowl that Bjorn had completed sat on her small table, a gift he had presented to her with shy pride, explaining that everyone in the household should have their own vessel, made specifically for them. The bowl was beautiful, perfectly proportioned and smooth as silk beneath her fingers. But more than its craftsmanship, it represented something she had never possessed before. Proof that someone had thought her worthy of time, effort, and care. In a world where she had been valued at the price of a pair of boots, this simple wooden bowl felt like a treasure beyond measure. 3 weeks had passed since Ingrid's arrival at Ravensholm, and the mountain air had already begun to work its magic on her spirits. Each morning brought new discoveries, hidden paths through the pine forests, berry bushes that would provide fruit come summer, and clearings where wildflowers grew in spring abundance. Most importantly, she had found a spot near the southern wall where the soil was rich and well-drained, perfect for the healing garden she had begun to envision. The idea had taken root during a conversation with Bjorn about the winter stores. He had mentioned that they sometimes traveled 2 days to trade for certain medicinal herbs, and Ingrid had found herself describing the plants her mother had taught her to cultivate. "You could grow such things here?" he had asked, genuine interest. Lighting his eyes. "With the right preparation and care, yes," Many healing plants thrive in mountain soil if one knows their preferences. The next morning, he had shown her the spot she now thought of as her garden-to-be, explaining that it received good sun but was sheltered from the harshest winds. "If you wish to try," he had said carefully, "the land is yours to use as you see fit." Now, as autumn deepened toward winter, Ingrid spent her mornings planning and preparing. She sketched layouts on pieces of bark, noting which plants would complement each other and which required separation. The work filled her with a purposeful excitement she had not felt since her mother's death. On this particular morning, however, her peaceful routine was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. She looked up from the herb bed she was preparing to see a small group of riders cresting the ridge, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in the finer clothing of prosperous farmers or minor jarls. Bjorn emerged from the stable where he had been repairing harness, his expression shifting from welcoming to carefully neutral as he recognized the visitors. Ingrid rose and brushed the soil from her hands, suddenly conscious of her work-stained dress and the practical braid that kept her hair from her face. The led rider was a woman of middle years, her silver-streaked blonde hair elaborately braided, and her cloak fastened with a brooch of obvious value. Her pale eyes swept over the homestead with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to judging others by their possessions. "Bjorn Ironhand," she called as the group dismounted. "I am Astrid Eriksdottir, and these are my neighbors from the valley. Settlements. We have come to see this wife we have heard so much about." The name struck Ingrid like a physical blow. This was not her stepmother, but another Astrid entirely. Yet the tone was achingly familiar. Cool, evaluative, with an undercurrent of malicious curiosity, barely concealed beneath social courtesy. "Welcome to Ravensholm," Bjorn replied with formal politeness. "You honor us with your visit, indeed." Astrid's gaze found Ingrid and remained there with predatory intensity. "So this is the famous bride, the one who was traded for boots, if the stories are true." Laughter rippled through the group, not quite cruel enough to be openly insulting, but sharp enough to draw blood. Ingrid felt the familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks, the old instinct to shrink away and disappear reasserting itself after. Weeks of growing confidence. "This is my wife Ingrid," Bjorn said, his voice carrying a warning that made the laughter fade. "She graces my home and enriches my life beyond measure." The formal words, spoken with such conviction, steadied Ingrid's nerves. She straightened her shoulders and met Astrid's gaze directly. "Welcome," she said with quiet dignity. "May we offer you refreshment after your journey?" "How gracious," Astrid murmured, though her tone suggested she found nothing particularly gracious about the offer. "We would be delighted." As they moved toward the hall, Ingrid caught fragments of whispered conversation behind her, speculation about Bjorn's motives, wonderment at his choice, and barely concealed pity for what they assumed must be her wretched situation. The familiar poison of public judgment flooded through her veins, threatening to undo weeks of healing. Inside the hall, Ragnar quickly prepared a proper welcome feast, her movements sharp with barely controlled irritation at the unexpected demands on her stores. The visitors arranged themselves around the main table with the casual authority of people accustomed to being the center of attention wherever they went. "Your home is quite isolated," one of the men observed, his tone suggesting this was a failing rather than a choice. "Do you not find it lonely so far from proper society?" "I find peace here," Bjorn replied simply, "and excellent company." His eyes found Ingrid as he spoke, and she felt some of her tension ease. Whatever game these visitors were playing, he was not joining in their mockery. "Ah, but surely your wife misses the companionship of other women?" Astrid leaned forward, with false concern. "It must be quite an adjustment leaving behind—" She paused delicately. "Well, whatever life she had before, I am content here," Ingrid said firmly. "More content than I have ever been. Really, how fortunate. Of course, we heard such interesting stories about your father's desperation to—" "Astrid," Bjorn's voice cut across the table like an axe blade. My wife's past is not a subject for entertainment. The woman's eyes flashed with anger at being checked so directly. Of course not. How protective you are, though one wonders what inspired such unusual generosity toward my wife, Bjorn finished, his tone making it clear that any other description would be unwelcome and uncomfortable. Silence fell over the gathering. The visitors had clearly come expecting to find Ingrid miserable and Bjorn embarrassed by his strange choice. Instead, they encountered a united front that refused to provide the entertainment they sought. Perhaps, one of the other women suggested. With forced brightness, Ingrid could show us her domestic arrangements. We are always interested in how other households are managed. It was not really a request. Ingrid recognized the tone. The expectation that she would comply, would open herself to their inspection and judgment. In Nordheim, she would have had no choice but to submit to such scrutiny. Here, however, she found herself looking to Bjorn, seeking his guidance rather than simply accepting her fate. He nodded slightly, but his expression conveyed trust rather than command. He believed she could handle whatever these visitors intended, and that confidence strengthened her resolve. Certainly, Ingrid replied, though I fear you may find our ways quite simple compared to what you are accustomed to. She led them through the homestead with growing confidence, showing them the well-organized storage areas, the clean animal quarters, and finally her planned garden site. As she spoke about her intentions for the healing plants, she noticed that their attitudes shifted subtly from condescension to genuine interest. "You know herb lore?" asked the younger woman, whose name was Sigrid, another painfully familiar name, though this one seemed less sharp than her Nordheim counterpart. "My mother taught me," Ingrid replied. "She was skilled in the healing arts." "Such knowledge is rare and valuable," the woman admitted. "My husband suffers from joint pain that worsens each winter. The traders who bring us healing herbs charge dearly for their wares." For the first time since the visitors' arrival, Ingrid felt on solid ground. Here was something she understood, a skill that had genuine worth regardless of her appearance or the circumstances of her marriage. "There are several plants that help such conditions," she said thoughtfully. "If you wish, I could prepare a blend that might ease his discomfort." The offer was met with surprised gratitude, and suddenly the dynamic of the conversation shifted. Instead of being the object of pity or curiosity, Ingrid found herself valued for what she could offer. The visitors began asking practical questions about various ailments, and she responded with the knowledge her mother had passed down through generations. When they finally departed, their farewells were notably warmer than their greetings had been. Several made requests for healing preparations, and Astrid herself, though still somewhat stiff, acknowledged that Bjorn had found himself a useful wife. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Bjorn approached where Ingrid stood watching from the garden site. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "They came expecting to find me miserable and you ashamed," Ingrid replied, surprised by her own boldness in stating the obvious. "Yes, and instead they found a woman of skill and dignity and a man who knows his good fortune." He paused, studying her face. "Does it trouble you, what they said about the boots?" Ingrid considered the question carefully. Weeks ago, such public acknowledgement of her humiliating beginning would have devastated her. Now, while still painful, it seemed less important than what had grown from those unlikely roots. "It troubles me less than it once would have," she said honestly. "What matters is not how we began, but what we are becoming." Bjorn's smile transformed his entire face, spoken like a woman of true wisdom. As they walked back toward the hall together, Ingrid reflected on how much had changed since that morning at the well in Nordheim. She was no longer simply the ugliest bride in town, traded for footwear and expected to be grateful for any crumb of kindness. She was becoming something new, a healer, a partner, a woman whose knowledge had value beyond her ability to serve. The transformation was not complete. She could feel the fragile places where old wounds still ached. But for the first time in Her adult life, she was beginning to believe that she might have something worthwhile to offer the world. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Ravensholm in pristine white, that muffled sound, and transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Ingrid stood at her chamber window, watching the flakes dance in the lamplight from the hall, when she heard the sound that would change everything. The deep, resonant note of a war horn echoing across the valley. The sound cut through the peaceful evening like a blade through silk. She had never heard such a call before, but something primitive in her blood recognized its meaning. Danger, threat, the need for men to take up arms. Heavy footsteps crossed the main hall, and she heard Bjorn's voice, low and urgent, speaking with someone she did not recognize. Moving quietly to her door, she pressed her ear against the wood and caught fragments of conversation that made her heart race. Eriksson's men were seen near the lower pass, burned out the Anderson farm 2 valleys over, demanding tribute from every settlement north of the fjord. Eriksson. The name struck her like a physical blow. She had heard stories of Jarl Eriksson the Red, called so for both his hair and his reputation for violence. He ruled a confederation of warriors and raiders from his hall further north, taking what he wanted through force and intimidation. The door opened suddenly, and Bjorn appeared, his face grave in the lamplight. Behind him stood a young man she recognized as Torvald, son of a farmer from the nearest settlement. "Ingrid," Bjorn said quietly, "we need to speak." She followed him to the main hall, where Ragnar and Olaf waited with worried expressions. Torvald stood near the hearth, still breathing hard from his urgent ride, snow melting from his cloak to puddle on the wooden floor. "Tell her what you told me," Bjorn instructed. Torvald looked uncomfortable speaking to a woman about matters of war, but Bjorn's steady gaze brooked no argument. "Jarl Eriksson has been moving south," the young man began reluctantly. "He's demanding tribute from every prosperous settlement. Grain, livestock, silver. Those who refuse—" He swallowed hard. The Anderson farm was left as an example, nothing but ashes and graves. Ingrid felt the blood drain from her face. She had met Lars Anderson once, a kind man with 3 young children and a wife known for her skill with healing herbs. "What does he want from us?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Passage first," Bjorn replied. "The old path through. Our valley is the easiest route to the settlements beyond, but men like Eriksson are never satisfied with just passage. He'll want tribute too," Torvald confirmed. "Food, silver, whatever he can take. And if he likes what he sees—" The young man's eyes flicked to Ingrid, then away. "He's known to claim other prizes as well." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ingrid had heard whispers about Jarl Eriksson's appetites, his habit of taking women who caught his fancy, regardless of their marital status, or their own wishes. "When will he arrive?" Bjorn asked, his voice deadly calm. 3 days, perhaps 4 if the snow slows him. His force is maybe 30 men, well armed and mounted. 30 warriors against 1 man, his household and whatever. Allies he could muster. The odds were grim, but Ingrid could see in Bjorn's face that he had no intention of simply submitting to Eriksson's demands. After Torvald left to warn other settlements, Bjorn moved to the carved wooden chest that sat beneath the largest wall, hanging. Ingrid watched as he opened it and withdrew something wrapped in oiled leather, something that made Ragnar gasp when it was revealed. The war hammer was magnificent and terrible, its iron head etched with runes and stained with the patina of age and use. The handle was worn smooth by years of grip, and the balance, even to Ingrid's untrained eye, spoke of a weapon crafted for deadly purpose. "Your father's hammer," Ragnar whispered. "Gram, the Thunderer," Bjorn confirmed, hefting the weapon with practiced ease. "It has not tasted blood in 10 years, but it remembers its purpose." Ingrid stared at the hammer, understanding for the first time the true nature of the man she had married. She had seen his kindness, his gentleness, his skill with peaceful crafts. But this weapon spoke of another side entirely, the warrior who had earned the name Iron Hand through deeds that were legend in the northern settlements. You mean to fight him, she said. It was not a question. I mean to protect what is mine, Bjorn replied simply. This land, this home, this family. His eyes met hers. My wife. Eriksson will take none of it. Against 30 men? I will not be alone. Torvald rides to summon our neighbors. Good men who have no love for raiders and bullies. They will come. How many? Ragnar asked practically. Perhaps a dozen if we are fortunate. 15 at most. Still impossible odds, but Ingrid could see that Bjorn's mind was already working. Planning, preparing for a battle that might well end in their deaths. There is another choice, she said quietly. Both Bjorn and Ragnar turned to look at her. In the firelight, the warhammer seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. You could give him what he wants, she continued, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. Food, silver, whatever tribute he demands, including, she could not quite say it. Never. The word came out like a crack of thunder. Bjorn's eyes blazed with fury that was all the more terrifying for being rigidly controlled. I will burn this hall to the ground with my own hands before I let that animal lay a finger on you. The vehemence of his declaration stunned her. She had known he was protective, had seen him defend her honor against the visiting neighbors. But this was something far deeper, a rage that spoke of feelings she had not dared hope for. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. I was only, you are my wife, he interrupted, his voice gentling even as his grip on the hammer remained white-knuckled. You are the light that came into my darkness, the warmth that made this house a home. You are brave and kind and wise, and you see beauty in things others overlook. He paused, his eyes searching her face. You are precious beyond measure, and I would rather die than see you harmed. The words hit her like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of herself and their relationship. In her father's house, she had been a burden. In Nordheim, she had been an object of mockery. Here, to this man who could have chosen any woman he desired, she was precious. I don't want you to die for me, she whispered. Then we must ensure I live for you instead. He set the hammer carefully on the table. Help me, Ingrid. Your healing knowledge, your wisdom. I need both if we are to survive what is coming. What can I do? Prepare what supplies we will need for wounded men. Gather what weapons we possess. Most importantly, help me think like a healer rather than just a warrior. In battle I am strong but predictable. You see the world differently. Show me what I am missing. The request revealed a humility that most warriors would never admit to, much less act upon. He was asking her to be his partner in the most dangerous gamble of their lives, trusting her judgment when his own reputation had been built on military prowess. As they began planning through the long hours of that snowy night, Ingrid felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. She was no longer the unwanted daughter or the pitied bride. She was a woman whose thoughts and abilities were valued by a man she was beginning to understand she loved. Truly loved, not with gratitude or obligation, but with the deep recognition of a kindred spirit. And if Jarl Eriksson thought he could simply take what belonged to such a partnership, he was about to discover that some prizes were worth dying to protect, and that some battles were won not through strength alone, but through the wisdom that came from two minds working as one. The warhammer gleamed in the firelight, but beside it sat Ingrid's basket of healing supplies. And somehow, the juxtaposition seemed right. They would need both instruments of death and tools of life to survive what was coming. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and in 3 days, everything would change. Dawn broke grey and cold on the 3rd day, and with it came the sound Ingrid had been dreading, the thunder of many hoofbeats echoing off the valley walls. She stood at the hall's main window, watching as a column of armed men crested the ridge like a dark stain spreading across the pristine snow. Jarl Eriksson rode at their head, his red hair and beard bright as flame against the winter landscape. Even at distance, his size was impressive. nearly as tall as Bjorn but broader, with the thick build of a man who had spent his life taking what he wanted through force. His warriors flanked him in loose formation, their weapons and mail glinting. In the pale sunlight, behind Ingrid, Bjorn made final preparations with grim efficiency. Their own forces had arrived throughout the previous day. 11 men in total, good fighters but farmers and craftsmen first, warriors only when necessity demanded. They waited now in concealed positions around the homestead, following the plan. They had crafted through long hours of discussion. "Remember what we discussed," Bjorn said quietly, not turning from his own window. "Stay close to the hall. If things go badly—" "They won't," Ingrid interrupted with more confidence than she felt. "We've planned well. Trust in that." He nodded, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. They were about to gamble everything on strategies born of desperation and hope. The column halted just outside the homestead's boundaries, close enough to demonstrate their strength, but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. Eriksson dismounted with casual arrogance, his warriors remaining mounted and ready. When he strode toward the hall, 3 of his men flanked him, while the rest maintained their threatening presence. Bjorn stepped outside to meet them, Gram the Thunderer hanging at his side. Ingrid followed despite his earlier protests, knowing her presence was part of their carefully constructed plan. "Bjorn Ironhand," Eriksson called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I had heard you'd settled into domestic tranquility. Growing soft in your mountain paradise?" "Jarl Eriksson," Bjorn replied with formal courtesy. "You honor us with your visit?" Eriksson's laugh was harsh. "Honor, is it? We'll see how honored you feel when you hear what I require." His pale eyes swept over the homestead appreciatively. "Fine lands you have here, rich soil, good water, defensible position. A man could build an empire from such a base. A man could also live in peace here," Bjorn said carefully. "Peace," Eriksson spat in the snow. "Peace is for the weak and the dead. I prefer prosperity." His gaze fell on Ingrid, and she felt his attention like a physical weight. "And speaking of prosperity, who is this flower blooming in your garden?" The mockery in his tone made her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet his gaze. This was the moment their plan truly began. "My wife, Ingrid," Bjorn said with deliberate pride. Eriksson's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. "Wife? Truly?" He moved closer, circling her like a buyer examining livestock. "How unusual. Most men of your reputation choose their women for beauty, not—" He paused delicately. "Other qualities." The insult was carefully crafted, designed to provoke Bjorn into rash action. Instead, her husband remained perfectly calm. "I chose her for her mind," Bjorn replied smoothly, "and for talents that are rarer than beauty." "Talents?" Eriksson's interest sharpened. What manner of talents? This was their opening, the crack in his armor they had hoped to find. Ingrid stepped forward, her heart hammering, but her voice steady. "I read the old runes, Jarl Eriksson. I know the herb lore of the ancients, and—" She paused, as if reluctant to reveal more. "I sometimes see things that are yet to come." The last was not entirely false. Ingrid had always possessed unusually strong intuition, an ability to read people and situations that her mother had called the sight. It was not true prophecy, but it was real enough to make her claims believable. Eriksson's entire demeanor shifted, predatory interest replacing casual contempt. "A seer, here in this remote valley. She speaks modestly of her gifts," Bjorn added, playing his part perfectly. "But her visions have guided us well." "Visions." Eriksson moved closer to Ingrid, his eyes studying her scarred face with new intensity. "Tell me, little seer, what do your visions show you of my future?" Ingrid closed her eyes, appearing to concentrate deeply. In truth, she was reading him, his stance, his breathing, the subtle tells that revealed his deepest desires and fears. It was a skill learned through years of navigating dangerous social situations, honed by necessity into something approaching artistry. "I see," she gasped, her eyes flying open with apparent shock. I see victory, Jarl. Great victory. But not here. Not in these mountains. Where? His voice was sharp with sudden hunger. South, across the sea. The Saxon lands burn with golden opportunities, but they are guarded by... She shook her head. The vision is unclear. There are symbols I do not understand. Eriksson grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh. What symbols? Describe them. Carved stones, she whispered, allowing real fear to enter her voice. Ancient markings that point the way to treasure beyond imagining. But they are in a place of great danger, guarded by... She broke off, staggering as if the vision had overwhelmed her. Bjorn was beside her instantly, his arms supporting her weight. The visions tax her greatly, he said with apparent concern. She cannot sustain them for long. Nonsense, Eriksson snapped. You will rest, recover your strength, and tell me everything these visions reveal. I have use for a true seer. She is my wife, Bjorn said quietly. Not a prize to be claimed. Is she? Eriksson's smile was cold as winter wind. We shall see about that. He turned to address his men. Make camp. We stay until I learn what this woman knows. As the warriors began setting up their encampment, Eriksson's attention returned to Ingrid. With laser focus, you will come with me when I leave, he said matter-of-factly. Your visions will guide my raids to glory undreamed of. In return, you will want for nothing. Fine clothes, rich foods, all the comforts a woman could desire. And if I refuse? Ingrid asked, though she already knew the answer. You won't refuse. Not when you see what happens to those who deny me. His eyes flicked toward Bjorn. Your husband seems formidable, but even the mighty Iron Hand cannot stand against 30 warriors. Unless, of course, he values his life more than his pride. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around them, Eriksson's men worked with practiced efficiency, creating a temporary fortress from which they could dominate the valley. Their weapons were well maintained, their movements disciplined. These were not raiders or bandits, but professional soldiers following a commander who had never learned the taste of defeat. I need time to consider, Ingrid said carefully. Time? Eriksson laughed. You have until dawn tomorrow. Gather whatever possessions you wish to keep, though I warn you, seers in my service have little need for domestic trinkets. He strode away, barking orders to his men, and clearly confident that the outcome was already decided. Bjorn and Ingrid remained where they were, both understanding that they were likely being watched. Are you injured? Bjorn asked quietly, his hands checking where Eriksson had gripped her shoulders. No, but Bjorn, he truly believes I have the sight. He wants to use me to guide his raids. Good. That gives us an advantage he doesn't expect. As they walked slowly back toward the hall, maintaining the appearance of a couple in defeat, Ingrid's mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. Their gamble had worked. Eriksson was interested enough in her supposed abilities to delay his violence, but they had also revealed the true depth of the threat they faced. He won't simply take tribute and leave, she whispered. No, he wants the strategic value of our position, and now he wants you as well. Bjorn's voice carried grim certainty. This ends only one way, with his death or ours. Inside the hall they found Ragnar and Olaf waiting with worried faces. The older woman took one look at their expressions and began preparing for the worst. How long do we have? She asked. Until dawn, Bjorn replied. And then we discover whether our preparations are enough. As night fell over Ravensholm, Ingrid found herself touching the silver amulet at her throat, her grandmother's final gift, worn smooth by generations of women who had faced their own trials. Soon, she would learn whether the legacy it represented included the strength to survive what morning would bring. Outside, Eriksson's campfires flickered like malevolent stars, and the sound of warriors sharpening their weapons carried on the cold mountain air. Tomorrow would bring revelation, one way or another. The hours before dawn crawled by like wounded animals, each minute stretching into eternity as Ingrid and Bjorn made their final preparations. The hall had become a fortress of quiet determination, with Ragnar organizing supplies and young Olaf checking weapons with the grave responsibility of someone suddenly thrust into manhood. In the flickering candlelight, Ingrid examined her grandmother's silver amulet with new eyes. The delicate metalwork she had always admired revealed patterns she had never noticed, swirling designs that might indeed be runic symbols, worn smooth by generations of handling. Her mother had always been secretive about her own mother's origins, speaking only of old knowledge and ancient wisdom passed down through the women of their line. "Tell me about the amulet," Bjorn said quietly, settling beside her on the wooden bench near the hearth. Ingrid turned the pendant over in her palm, feeling its familiar weight. "My grandmother wore it always. Mother said it had been in our family since before the settlements, when the old gods walked closer to the earth." She paused, studying the worn symbols. "I always thought the markings were just decoration, but now I wonder if my claim of visions was not entirely false." She looked up at him, seeing understanding rather than skepticism in his eyes. "I have always known things, felt them before they happened. Mother called it intuition, but perhaps it was something more," Bjorn finished. "Your ability to read people, to understand their needs, it goes beyond mere observation." I nodded slowly. "When I tended the sick children in Nordheim, I often knew which remedies would work before I tried them. When I worked with the animals here, I understood their needs without being told. And with you," she colored slightly, "I knew you were. Different from the moment we met, though I could not say how." "The sight often runs in bloodlines," Bjorn said thoughtfully. "My own grandmother had the gift, though she used it only for healing. She said the old blood remembers what the new blood has forgotten." Outside, they could hear the low murmur of Ericsson's men maintaining their watch. The Jarl himself had retired to a richly appointed tent, confident that dawn would bring him everything he desired. He could not know that his quarry was using these precious hours to transform from victim into predator. "Are you certain about the timing?" Ingrid asked, reviewing their plan once more. "As certain as we can be." Torvald confirmed that Eriksson always strikes at first light. It's become his signature. He believes it gives him psychological advantage, catching his enemies when they're least alert. "And our allies? In position. Haken and his sons control the ridge path. Eric the Smith holds the western approach with his brother. The others are scattered through the trees, waiting for the signal. 11 men against 30, but with the advantages of terrain, preparation and surprise. It would have to be enough." Ragnar approached with a steaming mug of herbal tea, its scent sharp with herbs that would keep them alert through the remaining dark hours. "Drink," she commanded with motherly authority. "You'll need clear heads for what's coming." "What of you and Olaf?" Ingrid asked. "You should be at the safe house by now." "And miss seeing that red-bearded pig get what's coming to him," Ragnar snorted. "I've lived through 2 clan wars and a Saxon raid. I'm not running from some upstart Jarl who thinks he can steal what isn't his." Young Olaf nodded seriously from where he sat checking arrow fletching. "Besides, someone needs to tend the wounded. And Ragnar knows more about battlefield healing than anyone in 3 valleys." The boy's transformation over the past days had been remarkable. Fear had burned away to reveal a core of surprising steel, forged by watching the adults he respected. "Prepare to risk everything for their home." "Very well," Bjorn conceded. "But at the first sign the battle is lost, you take Ingrid and flee to the high caves. Promise me." "I won't leave you," Ingrid said firmly. "You will if I command it." His tone brooked no argument. "You think Eriksson will give up his prize seer easily? If we fail here, your only chance is to disappear so completely that he can never find you." The thought of fleeing alone while Bjorn died defending their home made her stomach clench with nausea. Yet she understood his reasoning. Better one of them survive than both perish in futile heroism. "It won't come to that," she said, as much to convince herself as him. As the night deepened toward its darkest hour, they performed the ritual they had planned, a simple hand-fasting ceremony conducted by the light of the hearth fire. No priest blessed their union, But Ragnar spoke the old words while Olaf bore witness, and when they bound their hands with cord woven from mountain flowers, Ingrid felt the weight of true marriage settle around them like a protective cloak. In the sight of gods and men, Ragnar intoned solemnly, you are bound as one life, one purpose, one destiny. What threatens one threatens both. What protects one protects both. I swear by my sword and by my name that I will defend you with my last breath, Bjorn said, his voice carrying the weight of sacred oath. I swear by my blood and by my ancestors that I will stand beside you against all darkness, Ingrid replied, surprised by the power in her own words. When they kissed to seal their vows, she tasted salt and realized one of them was crying. Perhaps both. The ceremony complete, they settled into the strange calm that comes before battle. Bjorn spent time with each weapon, sword, axe, and finally his father's warhammer, cleaning and checking every detail with ritual precision. Ingrid prepared her healing supplies with equal care, knowing that victory would mean nothing if they lost too many friends in winning it. Tell me about your father, she said, as Bjorn ran a whetstone along Gram's ancient edge. Magnus the Thunderer, Bjorn said with obvious pride. They say he once held a bridge against 20 Saxon warriors while his men escaped across a river. The hammer has been in our family for 6 generations. Each bearer added his own victories to its legend. And now it's yours. Now it's ours, he corrected gently. Whatever happens at dawn, we face it together. An hour before sunrise, a soft whistle from outside signaled the approach of their final ally. Bjorn opened the door to admit a figure wrapped in dark furs, a woman of perhaps 50 winters. Her silver-streaked hair bound with leather cords, and her pale eyes holding the distant look of one who sees beyond the present moment. Astrid the Wise, Bjorn greeted her with deep respect. I had hoped, but not dared to expect, the sight. Who called me? The woman interrupted, her voice carrying the peculiar resonance of those touched by prophecy. There are currents moving today that will reshape the north. I would not miss such a moment. Her gaze fell on Ingrid, and something electric passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than sight or sound. So, Astrid said softly, the bloodline continues. I had wondered when the old gifts would surface again. You knew my grandmother? Ingrid asked, though somehow she already knew the answer. Knew her? Child, she was my teacher. Thora the Farseer was the most gifted, wise woman of her generation. The amulet you wear was crafted by her own hands, blessed with protections that have kept her line safe through dark times. Astrid's smile was sad and proud, simultaneously. She would be pleased to see her granddaughter grown strong and wise. The revelation hit Ingrid like a physical blow. Her grandmother had been a renowned seer, not merely a woman with good intuition. The amulet was not simple jewelry, but a protective talisman. Her own emerging abilities were not imagination, but inherited gift awakening. Why didn't my mother? And tell me, she whispered. Because the gift brings danger as well as blessing, Astrid replied. Those who can see the future become targets for those who would control it. Better to let you grow strong in ignorance than weak in knowledge. But now the time for hiding is past. Ericsson's hunger for power has brought him to the one place where his ambitions will be broken. You are the key, child, not because of what you know, but because of what you are. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to deep grey. Soon, Jarl Eriksson would emerge from his tent expecting easy victory and a valuable prize. Instead, he would find that some treasures cannot be taken by force, and some women carry legacies that burn brighter than any warrior's sword. Are you ready? Bjorn asked, hefting Gram the Thunderer with practiced ease. Ingrid touched her grandmother's amulet, feeling its warmth pulse against her palm like a living heartbeat. For the first time in her life, she understood what she was, not the ugliest bride in town, not a burden traded for boots, but the inheritor of ancient wisdom and the guardian of powers that predators like Eriksson would kill to possess. I'm ready, she said, and meant it. The battle for Ravensholm was about to begin, and with it the transformation of a scarred woman into the heir of forgotten queens. Dawn came like a blade drawn from its sheath, cold and sharp and merciless. The eastern sky bled from black to deep purple to pale gold, and with the first true light came the sound Ingrid had been dreading, the harsh blast of Ericsson's war horn summoning his men to arms. She stood at the hall's window, her grandmother's, amulet warm against her throat, and watched 30 warriors prepare for what they believed would be easy slaughter. They moved with casual confidence, checking weapons and adjusting mail with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Their horses stamped and snorted in the cold air, breath rising like smoke from their nostrils. Jarl Eriksson emerged from his tent fully armed, his red hair bound back with leather cords and his mail shirt gleaming like scales in the morning light. The great sword at his side had earned its own reputation, bone cleaver they called it, for its ability to split shields and shatter bone with equal ease. He surveyed his force with satisfaction, then turned his pale eyes toward the hall where his prize awaited. "Come, little seer," he called, his voice carrying easily across the frozen ground. "Dawn has arrived, and with it your new destiny. Will you walk to me willingly, or must I drag you from your husband's corpse?" Ingrid touched the iron ring on her finger, the simple band Bjorn had placed there during their handfasting ceremony just hours ago. Its weight steadied her as she stepped outside, Bjorn beside her with Gram the Thunderer hanging at his side. "I have made my choice," she called back, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "I remain with my husband." Ericsson's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Your husband? This mountain hermit who traded boots for a wife? Look around you, woman. See the reality of your situation." His gesture encompassed the armed men surrounding them. The hopelessness of their position, the certainty of defeat that hung over Ravensholm like a funeral shroud. "I see clearly," Ingrid replied, "perhaps more clearly than you." Something in her tone made Eriksson pause, his predator's instincts detecting a change he could not quite identify. The woman who faced him now stood differently than she had the day before, straighter, with a confidence that seemed to emanate from within rather than being carefully constructed from without. "Very well," he said finally. "If you choose to learn wisdom the hard way, so be it. But know this, when your husband lies bleeding in the snow, when his pitiful allies have fled or died, you will come to me gladly just to end the slaughter of innocents." He raised his hand, preparing to signal the attack that would end everything they had built together. In that moment, suspended between peace and violence, Ingrid felt something she had never experienced before, a rushing sense of expansion, as if her consciousness suddenly reached far beyond the boundaries of her physical form. The world shifted, colors becoming more vivid, sounds taking on layers of meaning she had never heard before. She could sense the positions of Bjorn's hidden allies as clearly as if she stood beside each of them. More unsettling, she could feel the violent intentions of Ericsson's men like heat radiating from forge fires. "Now I understand," she whispered, the words coming from some deep well of inherited knowledge. The sight was never about seeing the future. It was about seeing the truth. Bjorn glanced at her sharply, recognizing the change in her voice, the way she seemed to grow taller without moving. Around her throat, the silver amulet began to emit a soft, pearl-like glow that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "What truth?" Eriksson demanded, his raised hand wavering as unease crept into his voice. "That you have already lost," Ingrid replied, her words carrying across the valley with impossible clarity. "Your greed brought you to the one place where your ambitions would be shattered. Your pride made you blind to the trap you walked into. And your cruelty," the amulet flared brighter, "your cruelty has awakened powers that should have slept for another generation." "Enough!" Eriksson snarled, his patience finally exhausted. "Kill the husband, take the woman." His hand dropped like an axe blade, and 30 warriors spurred their horses forward with a thunder that shook the ground. The charge was magnificent and terrible, a wave of iron and death rolling toward the small group standing before the hall. But as the first horseman reached the point where the valley narrowed, Bjorn's allies struck with devastating precision. Arrows whistled from concealed positions, dropping riders from their saddles. Ropes strung between trees at horse height sent mounts crashing to the ground, their riders crushed beneath them or thrown clear to break bones on the frozen earth. The careful discipline of Ericsson's force dissolved into chaos as hidden dangers revealed themselves from every direction. What should have been a simple charge became a deadly maze where every shadow might hide an enemy, every tree might conceal an archer. "Trap!" someone screamed. "It's a trap!" Through the confusion, Bjorn moved like a force of nature, Gram the thunderer, singing its ancient song as it carved through mail and bone. Each swing was precise and devastating, 40 years of inherited skill flowing through arms that had learned their craft from the weapon's previous masters. Ingrid watched the battle unfold with eyes that saw not just the physical struggle, but the patterns of intention and will that drove each combatant. She could see where the next attack would come from, which of their allies needed aid, how the tide of combat would shift in the coming moments. "Behind you!" she called to Bjorn, and he spun just in time to catch an attacker's sword on Gram's handle, then brought the hammer's head around in a crushing blow that ended the threat permanently. But even as their plan unfolded with deadly efficiency, Ingrid could see the truth that chilled her blood. They were winning the first moments, but Eriksson still commanded superior numbers. Once the Jarl rallied his scattered men, once they overcame their surprise and began fighting as the disciplined unit they truly were, the mathematics of the battle would reassert themselves. Victory was possible, but it would require more than clever tactics and brave hearts. It would require the full awakening of powers she was only beginning to understand, and the courage to pay whatever price such awakening demanded. The battle's tide turned as swiftly as mountain weather, and Ingrid felt the shift like a physical blow to her chest. Eriksson's surviving warriors, still nearly 20 strong, had regrouped with the deadly efficiency that marked professional soldiers. Their initial shock had given way to cold fury, and now they advanced in disciplined formation, shields locked, and weapons ready. "Fall back to the hall," Bjorn shouted, his voice carrying over the clash of steel on steel. Blood ran down his left arm, where a spear point had found its mark, but Gram the Thunderer still sang its song of destruction in his steady grip. Their allies, those who still lived, retreated in good order, using the terrain and prepared defenses to slow Eriksson's advance. But Ingrid could see with her enhanced perception that it was a fighting withdrawal, not a victory march. They had bloodied the Jarl's force, but they had not broken it. Eric the smith stumbled past her, clutching a shattered arm to his chest. Young Hakon lay motionless near the well where she had once planned to plant herbs. The price of resistance was being paid in the blood of good men who had answered Bjorn's call. "Inside," Ragnar commanded, grabbing Ingrid's elbow. "You can see the wounded from there just as well." But Ingrid shook her head, her attention fixed on something beyond the immediate battle. The silver amulet at her throat pulsed with increasing intensity, and through its ancient power she could sense something that chilled her more than the morning frost. "He's not trying to win," she whispered. "What?" Bjorn appeared beside her, breathing hard but still formidable. "Eriksson. He's not trying to win the battle. He's herding us, driving us exactly where he wants us to go." Her enhanced sight showed her the pattern clearly now, the way the Jarl's men were leaving certain escape routes open while blocking others. "He wants us trapped in the hall." Understanding dawned on Bjorn's weathered face. "Fire. He means to burn us out." Even as he spoke, they could see Eriksson's men preparing torches and oil-soaked cloth. The Jarl himself stood beyond the range of arrows, his pale eyes fixed on Ingrid with obsessive hunger that made her skin crawl. "Your visions end here, seer," he called mockingly. "Come to me now, and I will let your husband die quickly. Refuse, and I will roast you both slowly while you watch your friends burn." The threat was no idle boast. The hall, for all its beauty and craftsmanship, was still wood and thatch. Once the flames took hold, it would become a funeral pyre for everyone inside. "There has to be another way," Ingrid said desperately, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed to slip away like smoke the moment she tried to grasp them. It was then that Astrid the Wise appeared at her elbow, moving with the silence of one who had spent decades walking between the worlds of flesh and spirit. "There is a way," the older woman said quietly, "but it requires a choice that cannot be undone. Tell me, the amulet you wear is more than protection. It is a key. Your grandmother bound great power within it, power that could shatter Ericsson's force like morning mist." Astrid's pale eyes held depths of knowledge that made Ingrid's newly awakened sight seem like flickering candlelight. "But using it fully will change you forever. You will become what your bloodline was always meant to be, a bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the gods." What does that mean? It means you will live, but not as other women live. The sight will consume you, fill you with visions and knowledge, until sometimes you will barely remember your own name. You will see the threads that bind all things, feel the weight of every choice that shapes the world. Astrid's voice carried infinite sadness. It is a gift that is also a curse, and once accepted it cannot be refused. Around them, the sounds of battle grew closer as Ericsson's men prepared their final assault. Through the hall's windows, they could see torches being lit, smell the acrid scent of oil-soaked cloth. Time was running out with the swiftness of spilled blood. "And if I refuse?" Ingrid asked, though she already knew. "Then we all die here, and Ericsson claims other victims in other valleys. The choice is yours, child of the far-seeing line." Ingrid looked at Bjorn, seeing in his eyes the same recognition she felt in her heart. This was the moment everything had been building toward, not just the battle, but her entire life. Every cruel word in Nordheim, every gesture of kindness. At Ravensholm, every moment of growing love had led to this single choice. She could remain the woman she had always been, scarred, ordinary, content with small happinesses and simple love. Or she could become something larger, more terrible and wonderful than she had ever imagined possible. "If I do this," she said to Bjorn, "I may not be the same person you married." His smile was fierce and proud. "You will be exactly who you were, always meant to be. And I will love that woman, as I love this one, completely, without reservation, until my last breath." The golden torque around Ericsson's neck caught the morning light as he raised his hand to signal the final attack. The ornate neck ring represented everything he valued: wealth, status, the power to take what he desired through force and intimidation. Ingrid touched her grandmother's silver amulet, feeling the ancient power stirring within its worn surface. Soon, the world would learn that some treasures could not be claimed by those who measured worth only in gold and conquest. "Then let it be done," she whispered, and stepped forward to meet her destiny. 6 months had passed since the morning when Ingrid embraced her destiny, and the world had indeed changed, though perhaps not in the ways anyone could have foreseen. She stood now beside the well at Ravensholm, its stones worn smooth by countless hands, watching a small group of travelers approach through the spring sunshine. The wellstone itself had been replaced after the battle, carved with new runes that told a different story than the old ones. Where once there had been simple marks denoting ownership and boundaries, now there were symbols that spoke of protection, healing, and the wisdom that came from seeing beyond the surface of things. It had become a place where people stopped, not just for water, but for guidance. The travelers who approached were not the first to seek out the woman who had once been called the ugliest bride in Nordheim. Word had spread throughout the northern settlements of the seer who had faced down Jarl Ericsson and emerged victorious, though the details of that victory remained shrouded in mystery and growing legend. What people knew for certain was that Ericsson's Golden talk had been found melted into an unrecognizable mass, that his surviving warriors had fled south and never returned, and that the man himself had simply vanished as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Some whispered of supernatural intervention, others spoke of clever tactics and surprising courage. The truth, as was often the case with such matters, lay somewhere between the prosaic and the magical. More visitors, Bjorn observed, appearing at Ingrid's shoulder with the quiet step that had become second nature to him. His left arm bore new scars from that terrible morning, but they had healed clean and strong. More importantly, his eyes held the deep contentment of a man who had found his place in the world and fought to keep it. "The merchant's wife from 3 valleys over," Ingrid replied, her enhanced sight allowing her to identify the travelers, even at distance. "She comes seeking help for her daughter's fever, and behind her the young farmer whose fields have been failing. He fears his soil has been cursed. Can you help them?" Ingrid considered the question with the careful thought it deserved. The power that had awakened within her during the battle had indeed changed her, though not quite in the way Astrid the Wise had warned. Yes, visions came more readily now, and she sometimes knew things she had no earthly way of knowing. But she had not lost herself in the process. If anything, she had become more herself than ever before. The healer, the wise woman, the keeper of ancient knowledge that her bloodline had always carried. The daughter has a simple lung fever that will yield to the right herbs and proper rest. The farmer's problem is more complex, not a curse, but soil that has been overworked without proper care. Both can be helped. It had become their routine, this morning assessment of those who sought them out. Never more than a few at a time, word of mouth was a careful thing, spreading primarily among those who truly needed help, rather than those who simply sought novelty. It kept their lives manageable, while still allowing them to serve their community in ways that mattered. The first visitor was indeed the merchant's wife, a practical woman named Greta, whose usual stern demeanor had been softened by worry. She approached with the mixture of hope and skepticism that marked most first-time visitors to Holm. "You are the healer they speak of?" she asked without preamble. "I am Ingrid," came the simple reply. "I have some knowledge of healing, passed down through my family. Tell me about your daughter." As Greta described her child's symptoms, Ingrid found herself slipping into the familiar rhythm of diagnosis and treatment that had become second nature. The enhancement to her abilities had made her more effective, but the compassion that drove her work had always been purely her own. "The fever should break within 3 days if you follow my instructions precisely," she said finally, handing over a carefully prepared packet of herbs. "But bring her to me if her breathing becomes labored, or if the fever rises despite the treatment." "What do I owe you?" Greta asked, reaching for her purse. "Nothing if you cannot afford it, a small donation to help with supplies if you can spare it, and a promise to pass along what you learn about caring for such illnesses, so that others may benefit from the knowledge." It was always the same answer. Ingrid had discovered that the gift of healing carried its own reward, and that trying to profit from it diminished both the giver and the receiver. Those who could afford to pay usually did so gladly. Those who could not were never turned away. The same young farmer's problem took longer to address, requiring a walk through his fields to assess the soil and drainage. But by afternoon, he too departed with solutions to his difficulties and a lighter step that spoke of hope restored. As evening settled over Holm, Ingrid and Bjorn sat by their hearth, the same magnificent stone fireplace that had welcomed her on that first fearful night so many months ago. The fire crackled with familiar warmth, and the wooden walls around them glowed honey gold in the dancing light. "Any regrets?" Bjorn asked, the question that had become a gentle ritual between them. "About which part?" Ingrid replied with the smile that never failed to make his heart skip. "Leaving Nordheim? Marrying a man who traded boots for a wife? Discovering I carry the blood of ancient seers? Facing down a jarl who thought women were prizes to be claimed?" Any of it. All of it. She considered the question seriously, as she always did. The visions that came to her now showed her glimpses of other lives she might have lived, paths where she had remained in her father's house, dwindling into bitter spinsterhood, or where she had accepted some other man's grudging offer and lived in quiet misery. But they also showed her the threads that connected all things, the way seemingly small choices could ripple outward to touch countless lives. "No regrets," she said finally, "though I do sometimes wonder what our children will make of having a seer for a mother and a legendary warrior for a father." Bjorn's hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly, where new life was just beginning to quicken. They had told no one yet of the pregnancy. It was too early, too precious to share with the world just yet. But both knew that this child would be born into a different world than the one that had shaped their own early years. "They will make what they choose to make of it," he said with the wisdom of a man who had learned to see beyond surface appearances. "Just as you did, just as we all do." Outside, the evening wind carried the sound of the stream running swift and clear past their home. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called from the pine trees, not a sound of ill omen, but simply the voice of a creature going about its ancient business in a world that had room for both the ordinary and the magical. The woman who had once been mocked as the ugliest bride in town drew her husband's arm more closely around her shoulders and settled into the contentment of a life well chosen. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new problems to solve, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, by the fire that warmed their home and their hearts, she was simply Ingrid, beloved wife, emerging mother, keeper of ancient wisdom, and living proof that true worth could never be measured in gold or boots or the cruel judgments of those who saw only surfaces. The story that had begun with shame and boots had become something far richer, a tale of love that looked deeper than skin, courage that grew from necessity, and the discovery that the most unlikely people sometimes carry the most extraordinary destinies. And in the years that followed, when travelers gathered around fires and spoke of the legends they had heard, they would tell of the seer of Holm, who proved that beauty was not in the eye of the beholder, but in the depth of the heart that chose to see it.